Within the Product Access Division of Uniphar Group, we solve pharmaceutical access problems each and every day, ensuring patients get the treatment they need when they need it most. Our tailored distribution service, extensive global supply network, and territory-specific regulatory expertise is unparalleled. We offer expanded access, partnering with manufacturers to ensure rapid access to new treatments, on-demand access, providing unlicensed and difficult-to-source medicines globally, and aid in development, supplying charities and NGOs with our pharmaceutical and medtech portfolios. With our integrated end-to-end solution, unmatched expertise, proven track record, and focus on high-value markets, everything we do is supported by the latest digital technology. A cutting-edge operational platform to get medicines to patients, and advanced digital platforms and educational content to connect and engage stakeholders, providing support for patients and carers. We also capture and leverage real-world and patient-reported data, providing manufacturers with invaluable insights. As a global leader with over 50 years of supply chain expertise in more than 160 countries, we are growing and expanding faster than ever. Everything we do because we care. We are committed to positive patient outcomes. Product access, improving lives globally.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the forum, IPHA's thought leadership platform for healthcare and medicines innovation. My name is Jonathan McCrae. I'm delighted to be the host of this series. This is a reimagining of the Innovate for Life annual conference, which has become a place to, I suppose, debate various themes in the industry, demonstrate value, and explore the world of healthcare and medicines innovation. IPHA are delighted that Uniphar are back to sponsor the series, so thank you very much for that. This is the 6th episode of the forum brought to you by the IPHA Self-Care Division, in which we're going to be looking at resilience and what the past 18 months has done to us all and how we've managed to struggle through it, because throughout the pandemic, we've started to look quite a lot at ourselves, haven't we? What sort of work we're doing, how we're sleeping, how we're eating, how we're exercising. And for many of us, it's been a time to reflect and even reevaluate what's important to us. So we're going to look and explore these issues and see how we can build resilience and where we might find it with an expert panel who are joining us this afternoon. They are psychotherapist Helen Vaughan, Anya Lynch, CEO of the National Parents Council, Andy Dunn, clinical exercise specialist at Personal Health, and Arvo Copeland, who's a physio, entrepreneur, and founder of Inner Strength. You're all very welcome this afternoon. Folks, if you have any questions, please do share them through the Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to tweet or mention any of this on social media, the hashtag is IPHA Forum. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. Helen, we might start with you, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Talk to me about your practice and what you've seen over the past 18 months, because presumably you've seen an explosion of people coming to you trying to deal with what's been thrown at us. What have you seen with your clients, and what are the issues that people are facing?
I would say explosion is definitely the right word. Like, it has been out the door busy since sort of January this year. When the pandemic first hit, things were quiet, as they were everywhere, because everyone was at home with their head under the duvet, not knowing what to do. But in the last year, or kind of a little bit longer, it's been nonstop in terms of new inquiries, and it's across the board. It's from, we work with children as young as 5 or 6 up through teenagers, currently exploding at the minute. The teenagers are really in a bad way. Couples has been hugely busy, because I think it's been such an intense thing for people to go through, but also for relationships to go through, and families as well. So across the board, we've been hugely busy. I would say the one thing I've seen most is probably anxiety, because people have just found it really hard. And a lot of the time, they don't think they're anxious, but they are, or there's a relationship issue that they don't know what's going on. And usually it's pandemic related at some level. So I think we're all impacted. We're all hugely anxious. Some people are very sad or depressed. Some people are, I don't know, there's kind of a wide range of ways that it's manifesting, but people will present with a relationship issue, and then when we drill down into what's going on, they are stressed about the pandemic, or they're struggling with working from home. And one client was kind of following his wife around and questioning what she was doing, and I was like, well, do you need to follow her? Do you need to go and see what she's doing? Can she do her thing and you leave her to it? And he was kind of like, I just never really was conscious of what I was doing and why. And he was anxious around the pandemic, but wasn't consciously aware of it. So I would say, yes, hugely busy. And there's a huge range of issues that are coming up. And resilience, I think most people think they're not resilient. And I can talk about that in a minute in terms of what it is, but that we are, because we're continuing to put one foot in front of the other and function on some level. So people are more resilient maybe than they think they are.
It's funny you should mention couples. I know a number of my friends or people that I know are going through separations at the moment. And, you know, as a friend, you think, this is not the time, but of course, sometimes the pandemic can increase pressure, and sometimes it can reveal differences that perhaps end up resulting in a separation. I mean, when someone comes to you and says, "I found it really, really tough. I need to, you know, I think the relationship is over." What do you say to that person?
I think what has happened with relationships is that those ones that maybe are separating, there was issues before and the pandemic has shone a light on it. Because if you think about it, have any of us spent as much time with our partners as we have in the last year and a half? No. You know, and all your social supports were gone. Your work was either gone or suddenly was at home when it wasn't before. You know, or your family life, everything was at home, and you're trying to divide that. If you have children, who does what? And, you know, who does the homeschooling? Huge issue. And it's not really homeschooling, it's emergency education, because we didn't choose it. It happened because of a pandemic. So I would say there's been huge intensity for relationships, and anything that was an issue before is now much bigger, because you're having to manage so much between the two of you, or, you know, depending who's in your relationship. And it's just been really difficult. So if anyone comes to you with an issue, what I would say as a therapist is just hear them, empathize, validate their feelings. Whereas I think a lot of us jump in to try to fix or solve, or don't do it, or do it, or whatever. You know, sometimes it's just hearing where they're at. And how does that feel? That must be tough. Gosh, you know, I can't imagine. And you just kind of empathize with where they're at and how they're feeling, basically.
Yeah. So you mentioned resilience. And I think we talk about it a lot with kids, but we don't really talk about it a huge amount when we talk about adults being resilient in the face of these sort of things. What does resilience mean? And have we started to appreciate our own resilience over the past 18 months, do you think?
I'd hope so. I think maybe most people have realized that we've done okay in the last year and a half. And some of us have had awful times through that. That's not to deny that. But resilience is kind of the capacity to recover from difficulty. And it's sort of getting through painful experiences without letting them overwhelm you. And it doesn't mean you're not overwhelmed at times, because I do think that's part of life, but it means that you can spot it, notice it, and recover from it. And it's not that either I'm resilient and you're not. Everyone has the capacity for resilience, and it's about noticing if there's a period where you're really struggling and you're like, okay, well, what can I do for myself to help? And, you know, in the midst of the pandemic, I do things like, you know, it's not checking your emails after a certain time, having good boundaries. It's going out for a run or a walk or a swim or whatever that is, twice a week or 3 times a week. It's doing those things for yourself that make you feel like yourself, that give you micro breaks from home life or work life or whatever's overwhelming you. So, but it's not necessarily about bouncing back from hard times, because that's too much pressure. It's literally your ability to crawl your way through a difficult situation, if that's all you can do, and to keep crawling, not to stop. Or if you feel like you want to stop, reaching out for help, or saying to someone, can you give me a hand? Or can you even just go to a therapist and say, I'm finding this really hard, and just having someone hold that space for you and sit with you in the dark is how I describe it, if you're not ready to crawl towards the light yet. You know, so it's trying to just bring it down to its lowest possible level and not pressure yourself to do better or be better than you're in a position to be at any particular time.
At the lowest point of the pandemic, I'm somebody who's really fortunate to never have had mental health issues that affected me greatly in my personal or professional life. But there were moments in that 18 months where I really understood the depths of desperation, because I really, really felt absolute despair. And I suppose this idea of self-care has really sort of blossomed out of the past 18 months, really thinking about what we can do to help us deal with these sometimes crushing feelings. What can people do to build their resilience, Helen?
Well, it's things like that you described, that maybe you didn't realize how important it was to get outside in nature, go for a walk, go for a run, spend time with your children, or have a break from your children if you need that too. But, I guess it's about adapting your coping skills to whatever is going on for you at the time, which hopefully we have learned through the last year and a half, and different skills were needed, different adaptations at different times. It's learning to have good problem solving skills. If there's something in front of you work-wise that's really challenging, okay, can you do a bit of a mind map in terms of what your options are, and trying to have flexibility of thinking, having a growth mindset, which is probably one of those phrases that's used often in business, but it's true. It's about having flexibility of thinking. If you feel stuck, okay, what options do you have? Is there someone you can talk to try to talk through through different things? But it's about having a better locus of control is what we describe it as, which is an ability to know you can cope, and that when stuff is really hard, that you have options, or that you can reach out for support if you need to, or even just talking about your feelings if you're finding it really difficult. It's just having an ability to know you can help yourself when things are really difficult.
Anya, we touched there a little bit on parenting. I always worry when I start talking about my kids in these sort of events that people think I'm a terrible father. I'm a good father, but there's definitely times when I find it hard. And certainly during the pandemic, having that role as teacher, trying to lift them and guide them and give them the attention that they craved when they've been cut off from the world was a really, really tricky time. Can you tell me a little bit about your role and how what sort of things you've been involved in over the past 18 months trying to help parents through the pandemic?
Yeah, so I suppose our role has changed quite a bit over the last 18 months, but predominantly our role is supporting parents with children in primary and early years education. So that can be through being their voice, which we've really, I suppose that's been one of our main key points over the last 18 months, 2 years, is to be their voice with the Department of Education and represent their concerns over this time in terms of that homeschooling, but also in terms of what their children are going through. And then separately, we provide support services for parents, which previous to the pandemic would have been a broad range of services. But I suppose over the last 18 months, nearly 2 years now, we have very much heavily focused on that mental health support, because that's what parents have been telling us, that they've been struggling with themselves and with their children most over the last period. I think particularly parents are telling us that their own anxiety about how their children are coping is huge. So it's not just about relaying their children's anxiety, but their own anxiety about the impact that this is going to have in the future on their children. But also, I suppose, anxieties around things that are actually happening. So, for instance, children may have started to have trust issues. So for pre-pandemic, a child would ask a question of what was going to happen, they'd be given an answer, and generally that was what would happen. And I think what we've found over the last number of months is that's completely the opposite of what's been happening. At a government level as well, we're hearing that things are happening and then they don't happen. They're hearing that they're back at school on Monday and then they're not back at school on Monday. And I suppose this has created some trust issues for children in terms of, well, who do we believe and when do we believe and how do we know to believe? So that's one of the issues. The other issue is friendships. Friendships have really been impacted for children. Children who go out and have free play, children who are seeing their friends every day at school. That there's been, I suppose, a rise of parents reporting social anxiety in their children. So when they were going back to school, for instance, everybody was very happy. We all knew that was a really positive thing for children to be going back into school. But lots of parents told us about the fact that their children, when they got to school, wouldn't get out of the car. That sense of, and I think as adults, we've had a little bit of that as well. I mean, we talk about can't wait to get to meet people again, but when actually that time comes, we're all kind of talking about maybe we've lost a bit of our social skills. So that's even more increased for children who may not have been practicing those social skills for as long as we have as adults, and then they're back into social situations that they they may have only just started to feel competent with, particularly if they've just started school, and those kind of key times, transition times from maybe early years placements to primary schools, key transition times between primary and post-primary schools. So there's lots of areas there that have been perceived anxieties for parents, but also maybe really kind of come true for children as well, as being very difficult.
And this has come out of the surveys that you've been doing, Oni, is it?
Yeah, so we've done a number of surveys over the period of COVID, and it has come out of that. But also we have a helpline that parents ring us and discuss issues with, and we've also run a number of events for parents over this. We have a training program ourselves, which is around for parents in terms of supporting their children's mental health, which operated way before COVID, but has been specifically more requested over the last 20 months or so.
You talked about mental supports being now the real focus for both children and parents. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, and I suppose that's particularly what parents are saying is, what can I do? What can I do? My child, isn't resilient. They weren't resilient before. They're less resilient now. And I think, again, as Helen says, all children have a resilience, and it's about trying to tap into that resilience that they have. So one of the key things we would say for parents is have conversations with your children. Sit down, listen to them. Listening is so important. We so quickly go in to try and fix things for children when we hear that they're in pain or struggling. But really, the important thing is that they get to explore themselves how they're feeling. They need to be in touch with their own emotional self. If resilience is their ability to cope with crisis in their life, both mentally and emotionally, they need to understand themselves emotionally, to know when know exactly how they're feeling about a situation, to feel good about themselves, to know they felt adversity before and managed and coped, and what they've had to tap into to be able to do that. And I think as well, parents come at us with children, often with more children, 2 or 3 children in their family, and they're saying they have one child who copes really well and another child who doesn't cope well at all. And I suppose it's trying to ensure that those children who maybe are struggling more, to tap into how they can experience success. So maybe the bar is much higher for children who are coping. They can cope with lots of different events that are happening in their life, and they feel that ability to cope. But for some children, we need to create situations for them to experience success, to feel their ability to cope with a situation and build on that. And sometimes that has to be supported very strongly by parents and other adults in their lives. And sometimes children will grow and progress from those successes.
Yeah, I mean, we talked offline about failure, and failure being an important thing. And one of the problems, I suppose, with everything being dangerous for a family to go out, at least that's how it was perceived for a while, that you cotton wool your child for a period, and there's that that over helicopter parenting, because you need to do that for safety, but allowing a little bit of risk back into their lives is probably quite a tricky thing to do now, right?
Yeah, and I think, parents do have to ask themselves these questions pre-COVID. Is there too much cotton wool around children? Why do we protect them from failure all the time, whereas we know as adults that's such an important part of life, is failing and learning from it, and experiencing that horrible feeling of failure, but getting up again and doing and trying again. So those skills children need to experience them. You don't just suddenly become an adult and able to cope with it if you haven't had those experiences as a child. So that failure is really important. But I think as well, the bit about how do we know how much risk to let back in, key to that is having conversations with your child, listening to your child, understanding their perspective. We need to trust children's knowledge of themselves and knowledge of their abilities, and negotiate with children around that risk, and have those conversations. So you might do practice sessions with your child. Well, if you're going to do this, what would you do if it went wrong? And let your child talk through that, add information if there's information missing, and then do trials and build on those trial pieces. So you give them I always kind of associate it with crossing the road. You wouldn't just say, well, I trust my child to cross the road as soon as they can walk and let them go. What you'd do is, first of all, you'd kind of stop carrying them across the road. You'd put them down and you'd hold their hand very tightly and hope they don't try and pull away from you. But when that improves, then you might cross the road and let go of their hand, and you trust that they will walk because they start to understand the risk and dangers of crossing a road. Eventually, you might let them cross the road by themselves, but you're looking from a bedroom window upstairs, hoping they don't know you're looking. And eventually they go around the corner on their own, and you know that everything you've done with them up until that point will hopefully keep them safe. Yeah. But if they come across something that upsets them, they'll come back and talk to you about it because you've had those conversations and you've listened to them.
We're talking about resilience, and I suppose, Avril, you're probably a case study in resilience for a number of reasons, having had a child on your own through the past 3 years, having difficulties in the health of your son, having tried to negotiate the exit of a business during the pandemic, but also where I might start is actually this extreme sports that you first started out in terms of our conversation. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the sort of things that you did and what you learned from the extreme sports that you undertook.
Yeah, so I suppose, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, my background has always been, I suppose, involved in sports. I played Irish, like, under-18 hockey, under-21, and was always, I suppose, really heavily involved in sport. I got a notion when I was about 21. I fell in love with Garth Brooks. So I decided to randomly I moved to Nashville, Tennessee to work in the music industry, in the country music industry. So I suppose during that time there, you know, I didn't play sport for a while when I first arrived, but then I saw this race on television. It was called the Eco Challenge Borneo, and it was these people going through the jungle day and night for, you know, up to 10 days, struggling through to get to the finish line. And it was at home one Christmas. I was like, oh my God, that's like the ultimate, what I'd love to do. So I emailed the team that won. I was like, how do I get involved? And really, that was kind of the start of it. I started taking part in these kind of ultra expedition races, they were called. In the States at the time, they were known as the world's toughest endurance races. So essentially, it was teams of 4 had to come together. They would navigate their way using map and compass for up to 10 days over like 1,000 kilometers, and mountain biking, climbing, kayaking, trekking, and all through the wilderness. So you had to hit these checkpoints in order. So you had to stay together as a team and hit these checkpoints in order, you know, and you were racing against all these other teams. Wow. So I got very involved in that and absolutely loved it. And it was obviously really difficult. It was day and night. So, you know, for the first 2 nights, you probably wouldn't sleep, and then you'd have to figure out your sleep schedule. So it's like 20 minutes here, 20 minutes, you know, wherever you could get some sleep. So I suppose that was a lot of people describe that kind of as a microcosm of life. There were so many highs and lows throughout those races. You know, there was one instance in Primal Quest. It was called Primal Quest Utah. And at the start of the race, it was kind of made for TV. So Liam Neeson was doing the voiceover. They had helicopters at the start of the race. It was going to start on like a 24-hour, you had a horse, and, you know, you could either put all your packs and your food on the horse, or one person could ride the horse. So all my teammates were like, oh, Avril, you go ahead and ride the horse. And I thought, oh, sure, I used to horse ride as a kid. I'd be grand. The morning of the race, the helicopters went up with all the cameras and everything, and the horse bolted, and I fell and I hurt myself. And I was like, oh, like I really, you know, I was in bits then for days, but I had to get through. Like, so we were on the mountain bikes then for, you know, 24 hours. And it was only after the race, you know, I actually realized I'd fractured my sacrum, you know, and so got through these kind of 9 days of it was killer now, I have to say, you know. But I suppose the main race director was a guy called Don Mann. And at the start of all the big races, he used to kind of say, whatever you do, just keep putting one foot in front of the other. You never know what's going to happen in these races, but whatever you do, and Helen kind of alluded to it earlier about, you know, crawling forward if you have to. And there were so many times like that where it was just like, you know, you'd be dehydrated, you'd run out of water, run out of food. And it was just about getting to that next checkpoint, you know, and together. And that was, I suppose, I learned a lot from partaking in those races, just because, one, around teamwork, but definitely around resilience.
Well, I mean,
sorry,
like,
go ahead.
Everything must have been easier after that. Like the rest of your life must have been a cakewalk.
Well, you would think, yeah, no, you would think it was. I did that for about 14 years. I did kind of these extreme races, and then finally got sense. But I suppose that really helped me, probably in terms of setting up the business. You know, I started it too many years to remember now, but a good few years ago, I started the business, and, you know, my co-founder came on board, and it was a really, you know, anyone who's done a startup will know how difficult it is. I think it's very glamorized in the media about, you know, having a startup. It's a really cool thing to do, but it is just so much hard work, and so many lows. There's, you know, there's a few highs, but there definitely is a lot of lows that come with a startup. And again, it's just constantly putting that foot forward. And I think, just, you know, as you alluded to, just in terms of my little boy. So yeah, for the last 3 years, I've undergone kind of fertility treatment, and anyone who knows that, you know, me being quite a proactive person, would always go, oh, thinking everything will work first time. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And it was 3 years of absolute heartache. And I suppose, coming from the extreme, you know, adventure racing, and thinking, God, like, if I get through that, where, you know, even in some of these races, people died, you know, like, they were so extreme. And like, you would think that would, but actually nothing prepared me for going through that journey of fertility treatment over the last 3 years. It was full of lows. There was very little few highs. But thankfully, I suppose this year, my little boy was born in April. And I suppose I was going through all of that, but also preparing to sell the company, which is another you know, big challenge in itself. But yeah, like, my little boy was born, and, you know, he's absolutely wonderful. And unfortunately, he was born deaf, and he has a few other issues, and that has been a big kind of, over the last 6 months, it has been just about, like, putting one foot in front of the other. And I suppose that's kind of how I think you just have to get through with anything, is, yeah, just keep moving forward, no matter, you know, if it's very slow or very fast, but just keeping, yeah, one foot in front of the other is kind of my mantra.
Isn't there a level of pressure, though, with that? I mean, people talking about, you know, self-care and self-healing, looking after oneself, putting one foot in front of the other no matter what, seems at times, certainly given what you've gone through, almost torturous. But you think it's really important, even if it's slowly, rest, but then keep going?
Yeah, I think it's just, even if it's small steps, you know, that way, like, even if it's really, like, really small steps, or just doing one thing to kind of help yourself to get that next, you know, that next, whatever that next thing is, you know. I think for me, that's always been the way it you know, I think, like, for me, with all the kind of heartache through the fertility treatment, the only thing that would get me through is, like, okay, what do I do next? Or what's the next treatment? Or who do I talk to next?
Yeah.
That was constantly that was the only thing that kind of got me through, to be honest, you know. So I had something to focus on, rather than just kind of, you know, having a pity party, in a sense, you know. But although there were plenty of those.
Your questions for our panel, please. The Q&A tool is at the bottom of the screen, and panelists, please do feel free to jump in and ask us. Yeah, Helen. Oh, Helen, you're muted there.
Forgot I was muted. I was going to pick up on what Avril was saying there. You know, when you're in the thick of it, in crisis mode, or things are really tough, that sometimes you have to focus on the next step, as she was saying. And I would say, kind of therapeutically, one of the things you can do in that is feel your feelings, and not try to distract yourself away from, if you're sad. You know, if you were doing fertility treatment and it didn't work, there's a sadness, and there's a grief, and there's a loss. And sometimes you have to sit with that for a while before you're ready to move on and take the next step. But one tip that I have used loads through the pandemic, and I think one of the big issues with the pandemic has been uncertainty. As Anya was talking about, you know, that children think they're going back to school, and then suddenly they're not, and they're not in control of it. So control is another big issue. So uncertainty, and also a lack of control. And one of the things that I've used and have used with clients a lot is to try to focus on what you can control. So ask yourself, within any particular situation, for example, trying to get pregnant, what can you control about what's going on at the moment? What can you not control? And if you're not in control of certain parts of it, e.g. restrictions, easing, anything, then try not to worry about it. And if there's things you can control, like your self-care, or what you do at home, or getting breaks, or whatever that is. It's learning to control the controllables and let go of anything that's beyond your control. And I find that's useful, even to give yourself a sense of control if you don't feel any. Do you know what I mean?
Very good. Andy, you've been very patient, and actually your story is really, really interesting as well. It's such a great panel today. So you are a clinical exercise specialist at Personal Health. You've had your own bout with professional sport and injuries that have gone alongside that. Maybe you might talk a little bit about that before we talk about your amazing work at Personal Health. So to tell me a little bit about your sports career and the resilience that you need to keep going in a sport like rugby.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Well, my background, I became a professional rugby player in 1998. So the game itself only went professional in 1995. So I was in that first batch of confused young men who had no idea what they were about to embark upon. And I think, I suppose the whole industry itself, professional rugby at that stage was novice. Training was very different, and fitness training was different, and everybody was trying to acclimatize to a new environment. I didn't acclimatize particularly well. I had 6 surgeries before the age of 29. So, and 2 of those would have been major joint reconstruction. So a shoulder joint reconstruction and an ankle facing in the opposite direction type injury, where I had to get a surgery and reconstruction there. Had a number of concussions in that period too. So
how is that not a career-ending thing when they reconstruct your shoulder, Andy?
Well, they've become very proficient at it. It would have been, surgeons, consultants will go away on fellowships and they'll come back from maybe from the US, and they've developed a micro speciality in one area. So it has become, I suppose, quite intricate and evolved at that level. So, an example might have been Paul Gascoigne when he played in the 1990s, got a cruciate knee injury, and that ended his career effectively. But nowadays, people are back playing within about 7 months. So, things do develop. But I think I suppose I began to understand the one thing was the resilience of my own physical body, but the general resilience in the human condition to, bouncing back from injuries. Helen, Anya and Avril have all alluded to it in different ways. But yeah, I suppose it struck up a curiosity in me. And I went back to, when I was told to retire at 29, I was encouraged by the Leinster rugby doctor at the time to look into medicine or physiotherapy or rehabilitation, purely because I'd spent so much time under his guidance, and he felt it might be a good fit. So I went back to study physiotherapy in the College of Surgeons, and I suppose from then on I've developed into different areas and things. Yeah.
Tell me about your work at Personal Health. You're working within medical populations and helping them regain strength. Tell me about your work and some of the clients you work with.
Yeah, essentially, so we have a team of chartered physiotherapists, and my wife is an occupational therapist, but we're working with medical populations that could be cancer patients, cardiology patients, people who've had joint replacement surgery. You could be working with younger adults with kind of chronic medical issues. But to keep it simple, what we do is we do exercise with them. Most of these people will be well managed from a pharmacology point of view. They'll be well managed medically. Some of them have come out of acute medical environments, and we help build their strength and recovery, and we do it through exercise. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we do. It's medical exercise. It's not commonplace as a service in Ireland. It is a bit more relevant and used in the UK and the US, Canada, Australia, parts of New Zealand. But in Ireland, it's a relatively new service. Allied healthcare professionals in general will have more time to spend with patients. The current environment medically is under-resourced and overburdened, and the gift of time is not there for a GP or a consultant, we will get to spend maybe 30 to 40 minutes one-to-one with a patient who may have had an open heart surgery, and we'll rehabilitate them through exercise. But you cannot isolate that. I know Helen has mentioned, Helen gave a lovely definition of resilience earlier, and Anya painted that very vivid picture of holding a child first tightly until that point develops where you let them walk around the corner on their own and you hope for the best. I don't think healthcare is altogether different, regardless of the age group of your patient. You're literally trying to help that person safely and appropriately put one step in front of the other until they develop the strength to move on. There's a lot of it is around confidence and reassurance. But what I ultimately see, and the team here that I work with, we see is that there's an underlying resilience to the physical side of our body that we possibly underappreciate. The body heals, tissues heal, and in time, with the appropriate dosage of exercise, for example, strength returns and aerobic capacity returns, and that sense of control over your own medical condition returns. You're no longer passively involved in something, you're actually actively managing it.
There is probably a big difference in outcomes from people who take the pharmacological care that is given to them, prescribed by the doctor, but don't see themselves as being an active participant in their own healthcare and recovery, versus those who actively throw themselves into rehabilitation, this idea of self-care and helping themselves out of that situation. Do you see a resilience in those people who have just come out of a hospital because of cancer and are now, taking the slow and painful work step by step to get better and stronger? Do you see a resilience in them that rings for the kind of discussion we're talking about today?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I see, I can give you one example that springs to mind. Is a lady who was working with us in the lead up to, I suppose, that first lockdown. When was that? March, Friday the 13th, and that's the infamous day back in March 2020. But this lady had a heart defect from a young age. She's now in her early 50s, and she had to get an open heart surgery, a mitral valve replacement, in January of 2020. Now, unfortunately, she had complications in the surgery. She ended up in intensive care. From intensive care, she slowly got better and went into high dependency, from high dependency onto ward level, and from ward level to discharge. And she was discharged the week of March 13th, 2020. Now, she absolutely and fundamentally needed rehabilitation, but she was immunocompromised. She had fluid on her lungs, and she was very, very deconditioned. So we had to embark into the unknown together, our team and herself. She had to do it in her kitchen. She couldn't really stand without support. So we started her exercise program prone on the kitchen floor. And we worked from there step by step over the next year to a point where a mitral valve or a heart patient like that may have a thing called a reduced ejection fraction. We all have an ejection fraction. It's how strongly our heart pumps blood out through the human body. Now, someone in her position had a very low one, and within a year of working in her kitchen twice weekly, her ejection fraction had recovered to normal levels. And if I look at that lady and I think about resilience, you're not meant to have favorites as a healthcare professional, but how could you not be drawn towards that and admire somebody who had to deal with that in her kitchen with the help of her husband and built up her strength week by week? So to answer your question, yes, I see examples of resilience on a daily basis, but I think to tie in with what Helen, Anya, and Avril have said, I think one of the pillars of rehabilitation we would use is this biopsychosocial model. It's what's happening biologically for you, what's happening in terms of your own psychology, and what's happening in your social network. And if you get all three of those things aligned, you have a much better chance, as opposed to focusing on, I'm just going to exercise myself better, I'm just going to, maintain a social environment that's supportive, but I'm not prepared to do the hard work. That doesn't work either. So something that we would lean on hugely as clinicians is that biopsychosocial model, and it does seem to fall closely in line with Avril, Anya, and Helen's experiences.
Is there something that we specifically need? Like, I mean, it's obviously probably different for everyone, but is there a minimum time or a recommended time we spend with friends, recommended time we spend exercising, a recommended time we spend exploring other things that aren't work?
Well, if I'll try and stick to my own area of knowledge. There is a finite exercise prescription for everybody, which I don't think people are aware of. If you can exercise in a what would be considered a moderate to vigorous level of activity for 75 minutes per week, and you can work out your heart rate zone for that. If you can do that for 75 minutes per week in total, you are considered at a high level of fitness by the World Health Organization. So people, I mean, I would work with lots of people in their, in the professional corporate world who, in my mind, over-exercise as a coping strategy for stress. So they will run until they can't run anymore, and they'll come home and it gives them a break from the kids and it gives them a break from work, but the body may break down over time. And they're actually just doing too much, and then there's people who are doing too little. But there is an exercise dosage and prescription for everyone. It's surprisingly attainable. And if we were to do that, I mean, it's not easy to get into that heart rate zone for a cumulative 75 minutes per week, particularly if you've got a medical issue. But that's one of the principles we would use. We're doing that with cancer patients who are going through chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and they're having 50 to 60% better outcomes than their peers who don't do the exercise program and go through the chemo. So if a chemo patient can do it, if a mitral valve replacement candidate can do it, I think a relatively healthy, physically healthy person can also attain these things.
Helen, yeah.
I do wonder, it's amazing to hear exercise-wise what the goals are, but has the pandemic given us a chance to do a quick audit of our lives in terms of those different parts, our social activity, our exercise, and our psychology, which has been good in a way because we've been forced to focus on what do we do week to week? What were we doing pre-pandemic, and was it working for us? And were we doing too much where you're running around the whole time and you're barely getting to connect with your family or other people or friends or whatever? But it does vary for different people, in my opinion. There's things, we call them the 4 pillars of wellness, which are, sleep and figuring out if you're getting enough sleep. And that's hugely variable for people in terms of how much sleep they need. Things like nutrition, so what you're putting into your body to get the best out of your body. Things like movement is huge, obviously, for exercise. As Andy was talking about, try to get up and move. And for some people, that's having your heart rate maxing out for a certain number of minutes per week. For other people, it's going for a walk twice a week. So it's trying to figure out, what are you doing and what do you want to do? What are your goals? And then the other one that he mentioned sort of is your connection. So it's about seeing friends, seeing family, doing sport that gives you a sense of connection, or a hobby, a creative thing. And it's trying to hit whatever works best for you within those areas, or within your exercises, and your psychology and your social stuff. And it's trying to just do what works best for you, and try not to push too hard, because often we expect ourselves to do all of these things, and if we don't, we're upset or angry or whatever, which then can be unhelpful at the other end. So it's trying to find the balance for you between what works and what makes you feel good.
Get to some of your questions now. Someone says, do the panel believe self-care has gained more traction as a practice during the pandemic? Helen, probably. The answer must be yes for you, is it?
Has it become more attractive?
Has self-care gained more traction as a practice?
Oh, traction. I think so, because I think it's been a bit of a buzzword. And I remember once on Instagram seeing someone suggest that I descale my kettle for self-care. And I was like, that is not self-care. That is a job which I'm happy to ignore on an ongoing basis. So I do think you have to learn to figure out what is self-care for you. And sometimes it's having a break for half an hour from work or from life, from home. You know, it's trying to figure out what doesn't push you too hard, because some people were learning languages in the first lockdown or writing books, and that's all great, but don't push yourself to do those things if you're not in a position to do them. I think there can be a bit of competition and one-upmanship. So for me, self-care is finding what works for you and what makes you feel like yourself, rather than you trying to learn Mandarin or trying to learn to knit. Or, you know, it's finding what helps you feel like yourself and not push yourself too much, but give you a break if you need it, or give you a push if you need it. So it's trying to find the right balance between pushing yourself, but not pushing too hard, I think.
Andy?
I think the self-care example I could use from the pandemic was, in terms of exercise, was we had a number of people who started the Joe Wicks program online at 7 a.m. and it was pretty unforgiving for a lot of parents who hadn't exercised and were suddenly jumping around with their children 5 mornings a week. Where we would have talked about self-care with those people is they're doing far too much exercise and activity in order to try and just get through. I think the self-care advice from that analogy was you need to understand to do less physically. Exercise is about movement. It's about enjoyment. It's about understanding how the body works. And in fact, what we can gain from that is, you know, cardiovascular fitness, improved bone density, maintenance of lean muscle, you know, release of hormones that make you feel better. And a lot of people would feel exercise at an intense or such a vigorous level is self-care. It's not. It's almost a form of self-abuse. You're running yourself into the ground. Self-care is very often cutting back, reducing your workload, understanding you can do a balanced approach to exercise. And that is only one component part of that whole spectrum Helen's mentioned.
Anya, when it comes to parents, I suppose we've all needed to look after ourselves a bit more when that whole lockdown learning thing happened. I think everyone realized, oh my God, I need some time to myself, or I need you to do this for a while. And this idea of not being able to cope or even do what others seem to think it was basic parenting, that really kind of took off. And I suppose that idea of self-care, parents, you know, saying, okay, I'm going to do this, and then after that, I'm going to be okay with what I've done. I think that's probably certainly something we've all kind of come to reckon with as parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot captured in that term self-care, but I think over the years we've had different names for it. We've always understood that there needs to be that time that we do what makes us feel more fulfilled and more ourselves. So it might have been called me time before, do you know? So it's something that we're very used to using those terminologies, and it's a kind of way of saying I need to step back and do something for myself to make me reconnect with myself. But I think, you know, terminologies sometimes mystify something that is just something that we feel in our souls that we need. And if we listen within ourselves better, we don't necessarily need the terminologies. One of the things that I thought was really interesting over the pandemic, when we were forced to not go to shopping centres and do all the things that make our lives very busy, was the amount of people that started noticing the world around them. And this is one of the really key things in terms of resilience and I suppose that kind of self-care piece, is that families were going out on walks together. So it's not always about having time away from people. Sometimes it's about the things we choose to do with each other. Yeah. So you go for a walk in a shopping centre, and that couldn't be further from self-care in some ways in terms of the chaos of it. You go for a walk along a canal or take a football out, and you start to notice the seasons changing, which all of a sudden becomes so much more dramatic to you because you were normally rushing through the seasons rather than them being forced in your face almost because you've got so much time to notice. So that sense of, you know, not noticing, parents noticing for themselves, but also drawing attention for their children to the things that are happening around them is really important in terms of that sense of being and connecting with yourself. So self-care isn't always about an activity. Sometimes it's about connecting in with what's important to us as human beings.
Fionnuala has dropped in questions quite specific, so I presume this is Andy and Avril, but she says, any recommendations for someone who used to walk until plantar fasciitis kicked in? Numerous treatments, but no relief. Walking was a survival tool during the pandemic. Any recommendations? Most welcome. I have no idea what plantar fasciitis is, so I'm leaving that over to either of you.
I'll let Andy, because I haven't worked clinically for a while, so maybe let Andy take that one.
Well, yeah, it's your plantar fascia is underneath your arch of your foot, and fasciitis. Anything with itis means it's inflamed, so it's inflammation of the fascia in your arch of your foot. So this lady, it happens usually when the workload is slightly too big for the structure to cope. So she may have tried to walk a little more regularly, slightly faster for longer periods, for too long, and eventually that structure started to give way. So in any of these rehabilitation circumstances, the principles still apply. As opposed to total rest, you start by walking again until the point it starts to hurt, and that's your signal to stop. There are small strength exercises you can do to try and reduce inflammation and build the structural strength of the tissue. And then you continue with your walk, and you go up in gradual, very, very gradual progression. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Andy. Fionnuala, I'm sure if you have more questions, maybe you might contact Andy at Personal Health. John says, I'd like to hear a bit more from Avril about your business setup and the challenges that you went through. So tell us about Inner Strength, what it was that it did, and the challenges that you faced, Avril.
Yeah, so the business Inner Strength really was set up from my time working as a physio. As Andy was saying, time is not something that health professionals have, especially in, I worked in Beaumont, so in a busy kind of acute setting. And one thing that I found really, there is, Andy's doing such an amazing job and kind of really leading the way in terms of kind of this exercise as medicine approach. And I'm really a strong believer in that and always have been. And I suppose coming from the States when I lived in Nashville and seeing the need for really exercise prescription, so along with medications and other type of treatments, like really seeing the benefits of exercise and using them to, for the betterment of people's health. And I suppose when I worked in the system, I realized, God, it's really difficult for a health professional to sit down. And so if I'm treating your toe or your knee, to go along and then let's talk about your physical activity now, and let's put a plan together around your physical activity. And so oftentimes we were treating people that were morbidly obese, had high cholesterol, had all these other risk factors. And yet, we're working on their toe or on their ankle, and it really just was just didn't make any sense to me. So I looked into this and did a lot of research around kind of exercise as medicine, and realized, I wanted to set up a technology that it would ultimately leverage the relationship that we have with health professionals and enable health professionals to quickly prescribe an exercise program that was customized for that patient. And not in a traditional, not in a physio sense, as in oh, here's an elbow flexion exercise or, a quad exercise. It really was around physical activity and lifestyle intervention. And so that's really how it started out. And that was kind of my big goal, was I was going to build this technology and have it in every hospital and every kind of clinical setting. But definitely, I suppose, as I, the first year I was on my own, which was, definitely one of the challenges. It was great for the first few months, but then looking to raise funds and to kind of build a business, I did find it difficult. And me being someone who's been very involved in team sports, I was kind of out there on my own, and so really did kind of need other people around me. But yeah, so once I got out there, I suppose, and everyone thinks they have a great idea, and I really believe prevention is key. But the way, I suppose, the healthcare system, it really is about treating patients rather than trying to prevent. There is a move obviously towards prevention, but it's not taken as seriously as treatment and paying for treatment. So I suppose we had to evolve in terms of the business, still focusing on prevention, but also looking at the treatment side. So while we came very much from the prevention side, we then looked at treatment. And so we looked at areas such as cardiac rehabilitation. So trying to support patients who had a cardiac event, and trying to provide technology to support them in terms of their rehabilitation post discharge. And then we also worked in the UK with Great Ormond Street, with children with cystic fibrosis. So using technology to support kids and helping them manage their disease and take more ownership of their disease. But I think, as like John was asking us, the overall challenges, definitely the challenges for me, obviously big challenge was I had no business background. I was coming from, you know, the country music industry and physiotherapy in the hospital. And so there was a very steep learning curve at the you know, understand the business world. And the challenges were finding the right teammates. So thankfully I did find Greg, my co-founder, you know, who's a technologist, incredible technologist. But that was definitely a really difficult thing, finding that right person. And I suppose getting everything to kind of come together really was one of the challenges. And just anyone, as I said earlier, I think, you know, startup life is so glamorized, but there are so many lows, and it's having the right people around you, but finding those people first, I think definitely was one of the biggest challenges of setting up the business.
Helen, talking about people around you, or we're talking about, you know, the things that we need for our own resilience, but what do we do for people that we care about who aren't seeking help? They're not practicing self-care, and particularly around the pandemic, you want to be able to say, just go talk to somebody or just go out for a walk, and they don't do that. How do we encourage more resilience in adults that we know, maybe family members or friends?
I think that's a hard one, because it's back to the question of what can you control and what can you not. And sometimes I think when something works for you, like I could convince everyone to retrain as a therapist because it worked for me and I love it. But you know, what works for you doesn't necessarily work for them. And when you're ready to get help, another person mightn't be ready yet. And it's the same with clients who come to me, and they might come for one session and not come back, because sometimes people aren't ready, or they're not in a position yet to help themselves. They want to sit in the dark a bit longer because they're just grieving, or they're traumatized, or they've been through something that they're not ready to move on from yet. And sometimes I think the difficulty is wanting to get in there and do it for them or help them do it. And sometimes it's just about listening, validating their feelings and sitting with them as they go through a hard time, and hoping that with your support, they might get to a point where they're ready to reach out and ask for help, if that's something that they will do in the future. But sometimes it's just sitting with them in the dark for a while and waiting with them, and letting them know that you're there for them, you know, hearing them, validating their feelings, and not trying to jump in and help, which I know is really difficult as a human being, because we all just want to get in there and, you know, fix it for them. That sometimes it's not doing that is actually what they need at that particular point.
Anya, in terms of parents who have been and are struggling at the moment, what can we do them to help them get through the struggles that they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think following on from what Helen's saying there, one of the difficulties I think parents and others can have in terms of trying to get support and help is feeling judged. They judge themselves, they're being harsh on themselves quite often. And the idea that other people will think the same about them as they think about themselves it can be really, really difficult. So I think it's again about being there for somebody. If you know somebody who's struggling, if you know a parent who's struggling, openly listening to them, letting them talk through things themselves, without that judgment, without trying to jump in and fix it for them. And likewise, I suppose that's what we'd suggest parents do with their children as well. Children are often the biggest critics of themselves, and you know, they feel that they're harsh judges of everything that they do. So they don't need other people doing that too. And it's about listening to them, understanding where they're coming from, and reassurance. And I think as adults, we need reassurance as well. So I think that they're all the kind of things that we'd look at. But certainly there are many helping groups out there. We have our own helpline for parents, but there are many helping groups out there. And it's finding the right fit. So sometimes a parent might say to us, oh, I tried that and it didn't work. And it can be on about the personal relationship you have with the person, you whether it's a professional or a GP or whoever it is. Sometimes they're not doing anything wrong. There's just not the right emotional fit. So it's try somebody else. And we'll always say, you know, there has to be that connection. It's not a blame issue, but there has to be a connection. So try somebody else.
Well, thank you so much to our fantastic panel, Helen Vaughan, Andy Dunn, Avril Copeland, and Anya Lynch. Thank you for watching. We have one more in the series of the forum. You'll hear about it wherever you heard about this. We'll be letting you know details via email and LinkedIn. Thanks to everybody once again, and to IPHA and Unifar. I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.